Good evening and welcome to the Cadlam Cymru revision sessions. The session this evening will focus on A2 psychology and will be presented by Sophie Bellis from Allen School in Mold. Now, Sophie unfortunately is having slight difficulties with her camera, but I can assure you that she is there and she's raring to go, and we appreciate your time this evening, Sophie. The session will last around 45 minutes and the teacher will run through the relevant content with us. If you have any questions during the session, please use the question and answer section and we'll do our best to answer your questions. In a second, I will add a hyperlink in the Q&A section. If you are happy to leave your name and email address, we would love to keep in touch with you so that we can send you information about any future events. You can click on the link at any time during the session. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording and any relevant resources will be uploaded to the e-sgol website under the Cadlam Cymru tab. But for now, over to you, Sophie Bellis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone. On the screen right now you can see an overview of what I hope to cover over the next 4 weeks of these A2 psychology sessions. Covering Unit 3, which is your behaviours unit, and within that unit you will need to look at 3 behaviours in detail. Now, there's 6 different behaviours on the specification for psychology that your school or college can choose from. So they will have chosen 3 from a list. Now, I'm going to be talking about schizophrenia in these sessions, as that is one of the behaviours that we do in my school. However, some of this won't be relevant to some people because it won't link to some behaviours that you're looking at. However, the revision materials and the exam technique is relevant for the whole unit. So even though some of the content may not be, the exam technique that I go through will. So in this session today, we're going to look at socio-cultural factors of schizophrenia. Now, as you are aware, you will have to look at biological explanations, individual differences explanations, socio-cultural explanations, and methods of modifying. And I'm going to touch on just one of the socio-cultural factors today. So on the screen you can see 4 pictures, and I'm hoping that these pictures start to spark the 4 main elements that they say socially that leads somebody to being more at risk of having schizophrenia. They are 4 of the main factors that you definitely need to bring into an example answer. I'm going to go through them all along with the relevant research that you need to include to get right at the top of that mark band. Okay, so starting off then, the word socio-cultural is exactly what you would expect. It's aspects of society and culture in which an individual lives, and what we're interested in psychology is the way that that affects the behaviour of an individual. So it's a combination of 2 things and the impact that has on someone. Now, socio-cultural factors have really reduced in popularity as an explanation for any behaviour really, but here we're looking at schizophrenia, and it declined because the biological explanations came in, and since the 1990s there has been a little bit of an increase in social cultural factors, but predominantly our explanations of abnormal behaviour like schizophrenia are sort of biologically based, and that's because we've got lots of scientific machinery and different evidence that allows it to be objective. It allows it to have numerical data, and if you're scanning somebody's brain and you think they have schizophrenia, they can't fake the brain scan. There's nothing that they can do that would change the biology in their brain. So although, yes, there has been a bit of a decrease in sociocultural factors as a valid explanation, it's still something that we have to consider, because as you know, when we look at nature-nurture debates, we have to consider both nature, which is our biology, and nurture, which is our environment. And this explanation really does come under that nurture element of schizophrenia. Now, there's a little bit of research at the bottom here. So it says that Jane Waddell et al., remember et al. Just means and others, proposed that to understand the causes of schizophrenia, the role of the social environment cannot be ignored. Both social and biological factors need to be studied as well as their interaction. So what Jane Waddell is stating there is the importance of looking at nature and nurture as an explanation for behaviour. So that's quite a nice opening sentence for an essay question. And at the end of this session, I am going to show you an example essay that we will go through. Okay, so starting off with those main factors then, those main risk factors that could lead to somebody being at risk of schizophrenia. And what's quite tricky is assessing the impact of sociocultural factors, because they're going to affect each individual differently. And everybody has a very different upbringing, and their societies that they live in and their environment is very, very different. So it's quite hard to pinpoint exact things that are going to lead somebody to get schizophrenia. Now, there's a branch of scientists that try to examine the prevalence of diseases and think, right, well, everybody that's currently got schizophrenia, what factors do they all share? So epidemiologists look at this, and they've come up with, like I said at the beginning, 4 main risk factors that could make you more at risk. So they are being migrant, so migrating over from a different country. And I'm going to talk to you later on about a study that was done on Afro-Caribbean migrants and how they are more likely to get schizophrenia. So being migrant is one factor. Second factor is being male, and there isn't a lot of research into this, but we do know that predominantly most people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia are male. And that's a really interesting one, because why? Why is it that males are more likely to get schizophrenia? It's a big question mark in psychology at the minute. The third factor is about living in an urban environment. Now, the word urban means somewhere that is built up, somewhere that is more city-like, and throughout my presentation I will refer to an urban environment as London, only because I think that's a place where everybody knows and everybody can sort of picture what I'm talking about. But obviously there are many urban environments. And then the last factor is being poor, but being born poor. They say that that is another risk factor, and what I'm going to do is explain why as I go through this. So one thing that, although we know that there's 4 risk factors, one thing that we're not sure is whether they work concurrently with each other or whether one poses more of a risk than the others. We don't know if living in an urban environment is the most prominent risk factor in causing schiz or not. Okay, we're not quite sure yet. There hasn't been enough research. So few, if any, sociocultural factors are claimed as explanations for all cases of schizophrenia. So we can't say, oh, because you live in an urban environment, that's why you've got schizophrenia. We can't make very bold claims about that, because there are so many different explanations and causes that could have caused the diagnosis. But there's lots and lots of research into the role of sociocultural factors interacting with brain development. And the bottom bullet point on the slide that you can see is really important here, because we can't say that it's sociocultural factors on their own, but we can say that it's a sociocultural factor that triggers a problem in somebody's brain. And I'm hoping the word diathesis stress is a familiar word for you. Diathesis stress means that you may have the prerequisites of behaviour. So you may have biologically a gene or a structural abnormality in your brain, but you may never ever get schizophrenia until it's triggered by something in your environment. So that's what diathesis stress means. Stress is the environmental trigger. Diathesis is the prerequisite in our brain, the biology. So there's lots of research to say that our environment triggers our brain, and that's why some people can be psychologically vulnerable. So that's the first thing that I want you to remember and consider when answering an exam question on this. Male, migrant, urban, poor. Those are your factors. Okay, so looking at urbanicity then a little bit closer. We've known since 1939 that there is a higher prevalence of schizophrenia in people living in an urban area compared to a rural area. And one thing we need to say, what goes on in an urban environment that could possibly cause that? So Robert Farris and Warren Dunham have done a piece of research and they've looked at the city of Chicago, and they compared the quite densely populated inner city centre of Chicago with more rural, less populated outskirts of the city. And they found that in the densely populated areas, there was more schizophrenia. Now, although, you know, that is a great piece of research that backs up the point that we're making, it's quite important to consider that Farris and Dunham only looked at Chicago here. So they're only telling us about people that live in Chicago, and therefore we can't really make this really big claim from that research when they've only looked at one place, and it's in America as well, so it's very westernized research. Another piece of research by Jim Van Os et al. Continues to clearly show a higher incidence of schiz in people born and raised in urban areas. So they've looked at people born and raised in urban areas, and they say that there is an increase in people getting schizophrenia. So there's two quite nice pieces of research there that you could bring in. But one of the big questions is why? What is it? Okay, we can say it's densely populated, but what specifically about an urban environment could lead to schiz? So I know these are very stereotypical, the photos I've put on the screen, but just think really, what is it about an urban environment that could possibly lead to schizophrenia? What's the difference between the two environments? Overall, I think one of the main things is the increase in crime rates and the increase of drug and alcohol abuse in an urban environment in comparison to a rural environment. Another element you could consider is just general stresses of everyday life. They're busier, they're more congested, and that could lead to a significant amount of stress, and therefore stress could lead to a psychological vulnerability that way. There could also be a lot of pollution, air pollution, that could lead to somebody being ill, and then the illness could lead for them to withdraw, and the withdrawal could also lead to a psychological abnormality. So I don't think that there are direct links between urbanicity and schizophrenia, but what urbanicity does is causes further issues that then lead to schizophrenia. So here are sort of some of the environmental features of urban life that they say link quite well to possibly getting schizophrenia. So Lydia Krabbendan and Jim Van Os again identified these factors. So factor number one is greater socioeconomic adversity. So anything that has the word economic in it means that it is to do with money. So maybe that may mean that it is slightly more expensive to live in an urban area, slightly more expensive to live in the inner city, and the pressure that comes along with higher demand of bills or rent or just general everyday cost of living. Something else they have is environmental pollution, which I said could lead to illnesses, general overcrowding as well. The use of drugs is maybe more apparent in the inner city and therefore could lead to illnesses, loss of job, loss of income, and again, that could lead to possible schizophrenia. Exposure to toxins and infectious agents. I think that's also due to having quite a big population and lots of overcrowding. And then lastly, greater social stress that occurs from living in a densely populated area. I live in North Wales, and North Wales, everyone sort of knows each other, everyone's very nice when they're walking, when I walk my dog, whereas if I refer to London as our urban environment, it's very busy, people have got places to go, people don't really stop and talk, and maybe, you know, over time, that stress of living in that area could lead to a mental health issue. But the exact mechanisms of urbanicity need to really be carefully considered, because recent research by the UN has estimated that by 2050, 67% of the world's population will live in an urban environment. Now that's a really considerable percentage of people that will find themselves living in it, you know, with all of the factors you can see on the screen. So they need to be really careful and really try and understand what leads to schizophrenia and why, and what we can do about it. What are the treatments? How can we tackle this problem that we're facing? Okay, so something slightly different from urbanicity, and another factor that you can bring into an answer here is social isolation. Now, Eugen Bleuler is another researcher, another name that's quite nice to remember, and they first coined the phrase schizophrenia in 1911. And one thing they found was that when speaking to people with schizophrenia, they tended to report a solitary background. Now, solitary means that somebody is on their own. So maybe they don't have very many friends, or they like to spend time on their own. Maybe they're slightly more introverted in their personality type. So if they have a solitary background with fewer friends or more limited social networks than individuals without schizophrenia. So we want to know then why. Why is it? Why is it that people that maybe have fewer friends or don't socialise as much, why does that lead to them being schizophrenic? So researchers such as Robert Farris suggest that people with schiz find contact with other individuals to be stressful. So it's having that interaction with other people. It can be quite stressful. It can be quite sort of anxiety increasing. So what happens is they would withdraw. And I think any normal functioning person, if they're stressed in a situation, they're not going to do that situation again. So that's quite a normal behaviour to have. So they're saying here that urbanicity and overcrowding could also lead to social isolation because of the factor on the screen here. So greater social stress could mean that people don't go out and they don't see people, so they isolate at home. They then conclude, so this self-imposed isolation cuts the individual off from having feedback about what behaviours or thoughts are appropriate. And in the absence of corrective feedback, they may begin behaving strangely. Now, what that means is every day within our lives, we normally behave in society how everybody else behaves. I'm sure you've heard the term sort of a group of sheep, everybody is the same, and people don't really like to stand out from the crowd. We follow feedback from everybody else on how to behave. It's part of the social learning theory, which is another psychological theory in that you copy examples of behaviour that you know and think are correct. And if you don't do this and you aren't in social environments and because you've socially isolated, then you don't get that feedback. And it may mean that you begin behaving strangely. Now, this is just a claim that they're making, but this is their explanation on how they think social isolation may lead to an abnormality in behaviour. Following on from that, you've got a really lovely piece of research here by Peter Jones. This is quite nice because it's really straightforward piece of evidence that really backs up this theory. So it says, Peter Jones et al. Reported the findings of a longitudinal study of 5,362 people born in a specific week in March 1946. So a really specific sample used here. They took childhood data between the ages of 16 and 43 years. And from that, they found that 30 cases of schizophrenia were diagnosed. So what they did is the 30 people that were diagnosed with schizophrenia, they started to look at their background. Did they socially isolate? Did they say that they had fewer friends? And the researcher found that the individuals, so the 30, diagnosed with schiz, were more likely to show a solitary play preference at ages 4 and 6 years. Now, solitary play preference means playing on your own and not playing with other people. And at 13 years old, they were more likely to rate themselves as less socially confident. And that suggests that isolation starts very early. Now, a really good thing about this is that maybe if people that worked in schools and people that worked in nurseries noticed and understood this research, they could maybe implement things in the child's environment so that they don't play on their own, so that they aren't led to early isolation from peers. And that could be quite an early intervention people could put in place to stop mental health illnesses. I know we're talking about schizophrenia specifically here, but just in general. So a really nice piece of research that backs up the theory of social isolation. Okay, going into ethnicity and discrimination as a factor. So this links to the migrant factor that I showed you at the very beginning of the session. So since the 1970s, statistics have shown that higher than expected numbers of individuals of Afro-Caribbean descent are diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, that's a strange statistic, isn't it? And really did create lots of questions as to why is it people that are Afro-Caribbean that have, you know, migrated over here, why are they more likely to be diagnosed? And this group are also more likely to find themselves compulsorily admitted as opposed to voluntarily admitted to psychiatric hospitals. Now that bullet point's really important because I'm going to come back to that in the next slide. So it's the fact that they are compulsory. If something's compulsory, then you have to do it, okay? Somebody's telling you you must do something. So it kind of goes against their own free will and their own judgments on their mental health. But it's really important in this piece of research that you remember that. The explanation they're saying here cannot be genetic, so they're ruling out any biological elements of the theory because the increased risk is not apparent in studies conducted in the Caribbean. So they've looked at biological studies in the Caribbean already, and they've ruled out the fact that there's some kind of genetic issue or genetic mutation in people of Afro-Caribbean descent. They've got to look more into it. So they have concluded that the additional stress, and again, there's that word stress, induced through migration to a different culture was suggested as being a reasonable explanation for those statistics. Now, we know that stress can cause somebody to withdraw and isolate and somebody to become quite ill, and therefore they are saying that the stress induced through migration, so coming over from a different country. Now, I don't know whether that is due to, well, the general stress of actually moving over here, but also it's living with a new culture, it's finding work and finding a job and having to completely deal with a different lifestyle. And maybe, you know, everybody knows that that's stressful. Even if you move house across the road, that's really stressful.